Thank you for your time this morning, councillors, and welcome to those that have joined us on live stream for this long-term plan workshop regarding financial strategy and infrastructure strategy. We're actually going to take infrastructure first, so Russell Pearson's joined us at the table. Welcome, Russell. He's going to go through the financial strategy with us, and we'll take questions as we go, so if you can bear that in mind. Okay, Russell, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think Rhiannon would have been here today to help us through some of the slides, but unfortunately she's not. So Patricia and I are your lucky drivers for the day.
Trainee drivers.
And Patricia has the clicker to. So I guess this is really just leading us through highlighting that the financial strategy and the infrastructural strategy are two of the key documents that actually do link us back to our asset planning. So I guess the two strategies are the high level piece that actually sets the overall direction. And today we're really talking about some of those key inputs into those two strategies. So, and it's an opportunity and a time to say these are the sorts of things that we are interested in the long term. And I guess that's certainly from the infrastructural strategy perspective, it is actually looking at a 30-year horizon. So we've sneaked a little bit. We've deleted the LTP process because that's Rhiannon's expertise area, and we're just going to run through what are the strategies, and then what are the key decisions for both the infrastructural strategy and then followed by the financial strategy. So
if you think about in the process of the LTP, we've been going through a series of workshops as we're getting through. So we've looked at different areas. These are the two big strategy pieces, and these are what we pull all the documents that end up being the work behind the consultation document. It's based off these two strategies. So where we go with our infrastructure and with our financial strategies, and they are symbiotic, so they do need to mesh, because if we have an infrastructure strategy that isn't supported by a financial strategy and vice versa, it's not a great outcome.
So what I thought was we just need to reflect a little bit about the timelines we're talking about. So given we're in 2023, I reflected a little bit about 30 years ago, back in 1993, and I thought it was actually probably a really good place to have a little bit of a think back about what was going on in the city. And as part of that, I sort of come up with a series of actions that were going on. We had lots of pipe renewals going on. We'd had the floods, and we'd got into and we were digging up the streets and putting lots of pipes in about 93. We were doing lots of bridge works as part of the flood scheme. People recall we were building dams and doing lots of other things. We had some work going on in Branksholme. We were putting a new clear tank and those sorts of things. Interestingly, I recall that it was the last time we built a housing care unit as well. We were planning for Splash Palace. Clifton Wastewater Treatment Plant had some improvements. The library and the car park building associated with it were opened. We were thinking about how we were going to deal with the Civic Theatre. And I guess it's after the post-87 stock market crash, the government reforms and the local government changes. So I guess really the purpose of this slide is to really think back 30 years. It seems like we're now going to then go and think 30 years ahead. But a lot of those things are still quite important key factors of our city that 30 years on from 1993, we are here now. And I guess our opportunity is to say, what does 2053 start to look like? And I guess that's really what the infrastructural strategy is starting to form a picture of. What are those things that we would want to do now for 2053? Because I guess if we could move back in time in 1993, would we make the same decisions we had that were made then to put the city in the same place we are now? So I guess that's the opportunity. So next slide. Thanks, Patricia.
Can I ask a question on
Yes,
that slide? So if you go back one, the line that says last housing care unit built, does that include the elderly house is that? Is it 30 years since we last built one?
My recollection is that in 1993 we finished Jim Brass Place in Alice Road, which was the last housing care unit that council undertook the construction of.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it doesn't include maintenance. But
Yeah.
that's-
Way you go, Russ.
So 2053, and I guess this is the. I'm trying to go to the end to give you some hints that might be what sort of conversation. So in 2053, what will our city actually look like? Because what we do and set up to go forward is actually what 2053 will look like. In 1993, I guess we probably thought 30 years was a long way away. I was going to have a photo of what I looked like in 1993. Didn't have any grey hair then, so but I'm not sure what I look like in 2053. It might not be so good either. But so the sorts of things that we might well have in 2053, we might have autonomous travel. We might actually not have people driving cars. We might have cars driving us around. So what will our roads look like? What will they do? What purpose will they have? Everybody might have a push bike or a different means of travel. So we might have thought more about what active transport. The Three Waters entity may still be by others, or so what will that look like for us going forward? If we look elsewhere in the country, we are bound to have had more weather events than we've had in the last 30 years. And what will that mean for our city? Will we be ready for that emergency when it does come, and what form will it take? And then what will our next decisions be around that? What will our community spaces look like? Will we actually have, more of places for people? Well, how will our city have reacted to 30 years of use, and how many times will we've been back to actually upgrade it, refresh it, to make sure it is the place where we actually have our business hub? How many councils? Will we only have one council by then? Who's to know? And how much further private investment will there be in the city centre? It's not necessarily council, but how much private investment? So I guess I'm really just sort of painting either end of the spectrum, where we're by looking back and looking forward. And the infrastructural strategy tries to set those sorts of directions that can be implemented and put into the asset management and the activity plans. It gives us the direction of the steer of what we're going to do, and starts to understand why we're going to do some of those things. And Patricia's side of the world is, how do we make sure we can fund those sorts of things? So.
Question, Chair, if I may.
Yes. Yep.
I think it may have appeared in the first slide, Russell, but it seems to me that one of the absolutely critical questions that I would put in that right-hand side is what the population will be.
Yeah.
Because there's such a range of outcomes. In the last 30 years, population's actually almost unchanged. It's gone down and then went back up again, isn't it? So it's pretty much the same. But in 30 years' time, climate change might double our population. Or if you believe others, it might half our population, and that's a pretty big range to be working from. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting one or the other. I'm just saying, to me, that's a very significant question, for up there, which is actually not on that list.
One of the things that I didn't have there is, what are the assumptions we have? And you're absolutely correct. What we assume for our 30-year plan could have some significant bearings, and population is one of those key drivers. And I guess the opportunity is for the infrastructural strategy that there is a regular refresh. So we won't necessarily write an IS strategy and leave it for 30 years and drag it out and see what we're going to do next. We get the opportunity to continue to monitor that. But some of our decisions we make from our infrastructural teams are longer than 30 years. So some of them are 50, 100 type years. So making some of those decisions and understanding what drives our community is key. And absolutely, population, our ability to pay, where we want, what sort of growth we're going to have, and where that growth occurs, all fit into the infrastructural strategy.
Well, yeah, the other question I was going to ask was, what was our rate collect in 1993? To get some relevance around cost and revenue.
What was the dollar worth?
Packet of chewing gum was 15 cents.
And I guess that's the relativity, isn't it?
Yeah, Nobby?
Yeah, Grant, when we look at that second list, are we in a position today to add to it, or this just the views that are coming forward from staff? Tricia?
We can add to it because it's your views are important.
Yep.
Because that's how Russell's got to look into when we get to those outer years of both the infrastructure strategy and the financial strategy, this all comes in.
Sure.
Yeah, look, I think it's probably it's scene setting, isn't it? So it's sort of getting our sort of mind thinking about what some of those things would be. But
Yep.
I wouldn't like to think we'd spend the next half an hour building up an exhaustive list of all the things that should be on there.
Because, Mr. Chair, one of the things the infrastructure strategy does direct us to is what's actually included within it, and the legislation is quite clear and quite specific
Yeah.
about the types of assets that you have to have that strategy to plan for. So as you say, I was just setting the scene.
Yeah. Okay. Was there something particularly you wanted to add?
Yeah, just a couple of three things. One would be the changing density of housing.
Yeah.
So we've had some discussion about going up as opposed to going out. A new range of industries coming in the next 30 years, probably some at the front end of that, and they require some infrastructure as well, certainly around aquaculture. And the last one is the lack of the council investment in South City and Bluff. So just on that last issue, it was interesting when we went to the presentation on Saving Grace recently, which was next door. The South City is actually decile 9 of 10.
Yeah.
And it sits within a cluster of 200 families across the country that sit in there. And that's quite an indictment on that city because we tend to be at the moment very focused on the inner city, the CBD, and yet we've got on our back door some areas that need some investment.
Yeah, which will be your community spaces thing,
Yep.
probably. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yep.
Areas, better areas to play in, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Randy?
Thanks, Chair. Look, as Chair of Infrastructure, I guess my main concerns, and I don't see them there, are the up and coming consent requirements for both wastewater discharges at Bluff and for Invercargill. Now, I just haven't seen any budgeting really for those. I know the Bluff is within 2 years and Invercargill 7 years, and we're potentially looking at figures that we really don't know them. And if we go discharge to land, then the land required is quite phenomenal. The whole process, Bluff on its own would have to be repiped somewhere. So that's one of my points. Do you want to talk to that?
So, Mr. Chair, further on into the options, that certainly is on the list of things that need to be in their strategy and the conversation about those, yes.
Because that is not hypothetical, it is real.
Yeah, well, that would be covered under the three waters entities, wouldn't it? Because that's part of what the discharge to land versus water is.
I think it's there's two elements to that. It's actually the community will need to actually to deal with it. Who actually drives that, whether it be council or an entity, I guess is a different question. But it certainly is on the list of things and options that need to be included in the strategy.
And the other one was AF8. Now, the Alpine Fault there's a 75% chance it will release by 2053. 2053 is the exact date they use. So that 75% chance is reasonably good odds. And if you're a council, would you look at your infrastructure and look at the potential, the risks, and the modelling around what sort of effect the Alpine Fault would have here? Obviously, it won't be the abrasive chop that closer to the like Queenstown, but we will get massive, shockwaves and stuff. So that, 75% chance, you can't really ignore it.
And I guess that's really in 53. What I was saying is, are we ready for an emergency? What does that actually mean to our community? And or weather events are the other ones that it's highly likely that we'll have a testing weather event within the next 30. I would be surprised if we miss.
I think we're going to end up with quite a long list, but there are quite a number of things can happen in the next 30 years. We are supposed to be net zero by that time. Does not feature in the list, but I think should. What does that mean? As I think it's quite closely related actually to the emergency planning around the AFA in some respects. It's something that's a long way out, but if we don't, have some plans in place. So anyway.
Oh, and the other one, the last one was smart cities.
Oh, sorry.
Are are we evolving into a smart city? And smart city is like a category of city where, is that something we've signed up for, or are we going to do it?
Don't think we've signed up for it.
So perhaps, Mr. Chair, with the next slide, we'll actually talk about what an infrastructural strategy is required to actually include. So infrastructural strategy is set by the Local Government Act, and it defines what has to be in and out, and it has to be for, as I've said, it has to be for 30 years and has to deal with your renewals and replacements, as to how you manage growth, how you do public health, environmental issues. Needs to include the financials for the next 30 years. So I guess it really looks to actually make sure there's not too many things just hiding over the 10-year LTP horizon. So it's some infrastructural strategies and across the country run out to the whole of life, so that can be 50 to 100 years in terms of some of our piped or other assets. It uses the similar assumptions across all of our plans. So as Tom suggested, that population is one of those key things that will actually drive this strategy. The infrastructural strategy has to include, and currently only includes, water supply, sewage treatment and disposal, stormwater, flood protection, and the provision of roads and footpaths. That's all the legislative requirements require us to deliver in terms of our long-term infrastructure strategy. So where we get into things like parks, houses, that's not necessarily a legislative requirement to be in the strategy, although that the asset and the activity plans will manage those over at least 10 and in some cases a longer period where those assets will be. So for instance, our properties don't sit within the infrastructure strategy.
Yep. Nobby?
Just a couple of reflections here. Based on what Rangi raised before around the three waters, and Russell's response was the sewerage issue or the waste issue will be a council or entity issue. Well, it may not be either, actually. And so we've got to have quite a wide brief here. For argument's sake, if the hydrogen plant gets up and running and it's looking positive, it will take all our wastewater away. So we won't have to find a land discharge or a water discharge, because they only want potable water, which is water that's been treated but not drinkable. And the same with the data banks. If they come, they need water for cooling, but again, it doesn't need to be treated water. It can just be water. So, and I've got people coming this week for that exact reason. So there are other options that we need to have quite a wide scope as we go forward, that the solutions we're coming towards may not be just one or two, it might be quite wide. And the other issue, I guess, which is up there, which is the flood protection. Again, we don't have the final leader data yet from Environment South, and when we have that, that will give us some modelling that we can actually, in a computerised way, pour water into the hills around South and see where the flooding comes out, and put more in and see where it goes. Because we've tended, from my perspective, to often deal with flood protection. It just means you build more banks, but all that does is pushes the problem somewhere else.
When is that information coming?
It's soon.
October, wasn't it?
It's soon. They've got
very soon.
very
It's
soon.
not already
Yeah.
here.
Steve's got his hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a microphone. Good morning, councillors. Environment South have completed that LiDAR data project now. It's just arrived
Okay.
on the website, so the team are now working through the specific on Sandy Point, but it is available.
Right.
I think, sorry, through your chair, the actual data is, only the first part of the story. There's a huge amount of analysis that's got to be done, and it's one of the things that climate change group that Leslie and I sit on are talking about.
Yes.
At some point, we will have to discuss who pays for that. And to the extent to which that's paid by Environment Southland, or the extent to which it's paid by the city. If it's paid by Environment Southland, we might come 8th on the list or something, because a lot of concern about Goa, Matara and so forth. So we, I think all of the flying has been done actually, and the data is just about ready to be launched. but it'll just be a series of dots and numbers. It's not going to tell us anything until the analysis is done. So, but I mean, that's all doable within a year. So I think within a year, we ought to have the data that allows us to make the kind of decisions.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Leslie?
Yeah, that's where we've got to.
The other thing I'd remind councillors as well, for flood protection and control works, that is not a significant activity of this council.
No.
We manage one piece of flood banks, being the new stop bank along Stead Street and Cobb Road, which we've upgraded to a higher standard. So in terms of an infrastructure strategy, in terms of that 30+ year horizon, I guess our exposure to change or risk in that space would be seen to be relatively low, and we should have a degree of comfort that it's at least strong enough at the moment. Whether it's high enough will be climate change.
Yeah. The thing though is, and it's a bit to Tom's point, where if Invercargill City's a low priority because they focus on the Matera catchment, for example, we've still got citizens that need protected. So we can't just sort of leave it, can we? We've got to use that data to inform us, and we might have to pull some of that work forward ourselves.
I guess one of the things about the data which Tom talks about is it does allow us to model rainfall at different levels.
Yeah,
so it's a little bit like pouring water. You put one cup into the system and see what happens. Put 2 cups in. So the beauty of that is it forces you to think outside the square.
Yeah. So
a good example is Gore, recently flooded in recent times. They're now looking at, hey, we might burst a stop bank before Gore as the water comes down and let it run onto farmland as opposed to running into residential area.
Yeah.
So a whole lots of new thinking around some of the stuff. And how do you protect certain key assets like airports and things like that.
Yeah, no. Ria, you had your hand up. Are you?
I just, Russell was looking at the provision of roads and footpaths and wondered, in your area of expertise, do you foresee infrastructure placement locations changing from out of the road into footpaths, for instance, and being able to look at that future of smart cities?
I guess the road corridor is used for many things, and how we use them over whether it's a smart city or a transport, it's going to be what do we want it to do. But I don't think we're going to get transformational change in terms of our whole road corridor in 30 years. I think we will struggle to change a lot of our way we use our networks over the next 30 years. I don't think we're going to see, and we're not necessarily predicting or seeking funding to actually change our road network significantly over that period, because we've got, everybody says we've got nice big wide roads. How do we allocate them? I think the challenges that council might face is how do you use them in a different sense. It may well be that in time there may well be consideration or requests to remove parking and have better cycle lanes on roads. I'm not sure. That's not necessarily an easy topic to deal with, but it actually is. If you want to change the way you use your community, that it may well be some of the things that you need to do to actually get a solution. So not sure I've answered your question fully, but I think roads and footpaths are going to be one of the things that will remain with council, and it will be something that will become part of our core infrastructure about how do we manage those and how do we use them for the greatest benefit for our community going forward.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
So one of our vulnerabilities, it seems to me, with the lifelines is actually between Invercargill and Bluff. When are we going to start talking about that seriously?
You're talking about the road?
I know Russell's answer, I could just about repeat it. It's a Waka Kotahi issue, but it's also our issue because Bluff is part of Invercargill. So how are we going to advance that discussion?
Totally agree, and I think there's a series of steps there, and I know that Waka Kotahi have sought some funding in the short term to raise some of those low-lying areas of the state highway, which would be a significant improvement. Anywhere where you've only got a single point of access, whether it be for a pipeline or a road, you have a vulnerability that if that's closed, you are cut off for the period of time until you can re-establish it. Certainly with climate change impacting those things over a longer period of time, our access to Bluff will be a prime consideration for both council and Waka Kotahi. But I'm more optimistic now that they've actually have some funding in the pipeline to actually be able to improve that in the short term, because there are sections of the road that do get consumed by water in high tides, which really is quite a unacceptable outcome for a state highway. I would have thought.
And have we any other lifeline roads that are similarly going to be challenged over that 50 years?
We will have roads that will be, but we're relatively fortunate that we aren't necessarily as dependent on the coastline directly. There'll be some of the lesser used roads, but our grid networks and how we manage, certainly around Bond Street and those industrial areas, how we mitigate that for a period of time will be a question. Because if we're lower than the water, we'll have to keep the water out.
Yeah, Pania.
I just wanted to point that this was sort of raised at the Buck Community College, and one of the things that we were actually hoping for was to have timelines in regards to the works being done, because that's one thing that's invisible, is that there is no timeline around the pieces of work that's required on that road.
Mr. Chair, one of the things that we continue to work closely with Waka Kotahi is that we don't fund work on the state highway. I'm absolutely certain that if we wish to fund the work and do it, that they would jump up and down, but there's no logical reason why we would take over their responsibility where it is a responsibility. I guess our role as a whole of council will be to continue to advocate for them and the importance of what that lifelines, the connection to the community will be, and we should continue to push that case as strongly as we can, so that we get the right share of money at the right time to protect our access to our communities.
Okay.
Okay, so then we'll jump on to what the finance strategy is. So again, it's legally required, and it identifies our approach to prudent financial management of funding and expenditure. So there's some key assumptions that underpin this, as do underpin the whole of the LTP, which is our population changes, but also our land use changes, which is much to what the Mayor has said earlier this morning, and the CapEx and OpEx associated with how we may respond to those changes. Sets out that capital expenditure on those core infrastructure. So that's why the financial strategy matches the infrastructure strategy with a minimum of 30 years. We also include some key decisions that sit in that, which includes limits on rates increases and debt, and also rates affordability, but also sets the policies in relation to borrowing and investment. So those are the core bits legislatively that we have in the financial strategy. In relation to investment, we're meaning those key measures that we may have in relation to our investments in Invercargill City Holdings Group, and the levels of return that we'll be looking on in investments. And we'll discuss that as we get on. That's it from that.
Any questions? Nobby?
Yeah, just a reflection on that. I don't see this as an area of significant change for us. Historically, we've done very well. When I compare with our Otago Southland colleagues, and even some in the Canterbury district, we're in a much, much better fiscal position than they are. And that's not just by choice. It's because we've managed well in the past. So we maintain what we've done in the past. I think we'll be in a good position in the future.
Tom?
I know I have asked this question before. I'm interested in if the thinking's moved on at all. But if as a consequence of Three Waters or some other version of that in the future, $1 billion worth of assets come out of our hands and into the hands of somebody else, so that we are borrowing on a much lower asset base, how is that going to affect our ability to borrow?
It doesn't affect our ability to borrow, because via our GFA, our borrowing is based off our income. So it's not the losing of the asset value, it's the losing of the collection of water rates. that becomes an issue, and that's something that we are going to be busy modelling very shortly.
Okay, thank you.
But as a sense, how much of that would it be? A 30% impact on rate take?
Yeah. At least.
Sorry, say that
A
again.
30%
About a
impact on
30%.
rate take.
So,
Sorry,
but it's across the city, roughly 30%, off the top of my head. But that's because not everybody has water or sewage. So in some parts, people's, if you think about it from a ratepayer, they'll pay, what they pay us will be split between us and a water entity if that goes ahead, but they might be paying more to the water entity going forward.
So sorry, can I ask
Yeah.
because I thought I understood the answer, then Grant confused it for me. So are you saying then that as a consequence of the reduced rates take, it will actually reduce our ability to borrow by about 30%? And does that flow through to the ability of Holdco to borrow?
No.
Okay, so it's limited to the city.
It's limited to the councils because in the way the council security on their debt works, it works off our ability to rate.
Okay. And Holdco's borrowing is based on their asset base, is that the...
Our borrowing is based on the uncalled capital. And what you've got at the moment is a situation where council recognises the risk to council from that uncalled capital. So for those that aren't aware, uncalled capital is basically shares that we've issued to council but that they haven't been paid. And so in the event that the holding company required funds or became insolvent, the liquidator in the ordinary course would walk in and say to council, you need to pay for those shares. And so council records that as a contingent liability on their books at the moment. But our borrowing is not a function of our revenue or our assets, as much as there are some conditions around our borrowing that relate to our revenue and our assets. Fundamentally, it always falls back to being capped at the uncalled capital issued to council.
But does that then mean that the council's ability to satisfy its uncalled capital, which it would have to do through borrowing presumably, is going to be reduced as a consequence of Three Waters or something like that, and therefore the ability to... Won't the uncalled capital fall as a consequence of that?
It doesn't have to. Council, as I said, council needs to, and we've been doing this for the last few years, needs to make an assessment as to the realistic prospect of that occurring and therefore the allowance it makes for that contingent liability. At the moment, council's got a very conservative position where effectively the entire uncalled capital is taken away from your borrowing. But that, in essence, is an assumption that you've got 100% likelihood.
So it can be risk adjusted.
It could be risk adjusted.
Yeah, but there is some materiality to an impact.
Yeah, just touching on the Three Water modelling now. Can someone explain? So we've got 14 million in Three Water debt. Queenstown Lakes District has 160 in Three Water debt. Dunedin's got a massive amount as well. You put them all together, say for entity JK, whatever it is. We all then split it up and we pay per rata, we pay per person a share of that combined debt. Now, obviously, that is no longer a debt for council. That is a debt of the entity, and so we don't have to worry about that. The entity would bill the ratepayer, or does it bill council, or how does that all work? How does the end result come? Does council wash its hands completely of if the entity goes ahead?
They're very good questions.
I could probably help with that, Grant.
Yeah.
The feedback we've heard from DIA around the entities is that Rangi's quite right. The debt goes. We will get a proportionate pro rata per capita cost going out to each ratepayer and the entity, so it'll be the same regardless of where you live. So we will cross subsidise, but in the interim, and Michael can tell me if I've got this wrong, but certainly the DIA have said that in the interim, council will collect the rates. So we will physically collect the rates. The risk, I guess, for that is that as the rates escalate up, and they will escalate up quite quickly for us, we'll be seen to be the problem that's pushed the rates up, when in fact we're not.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at, currently we pay about 860 per person, per household. That's going to easily escalate, if you look at the figures I just gave you, to 3,000 per household. Just like that. Just like that, all of a sudden. And the rates will come from us. We'll be perhaps on an ICC letterhead, maybe, unless we can be clever and not have that. So just looking, that's really, at the end of the day, when we look at all our forward forecasts and stuff like that, really, when this hits, it's just going to blow everything else out of the water and make roading and all our other stuff seem insignificant to currently what we pay in water rates, on 3 water rates. So, yeah, and yet we have no say.
No, we don't.
But if we take it back to what the purpose of the LTP is here, that yes, I think you've got a slide coming up, haven't you, Russell, around 3 waters. Yes, those are issues that we're going to have to deal with operationally in the short term. We need to be sort of focused for this session on the more longer term, rather than those are issues. Let's deal with some strategic bits going forward.
No,
Just wanted to clarify what Patricia said before about the loss of the asset, or the value of the asset, as opposed to the loss of the revenue that comes from that asset, which is the 3 water assets versus the rateable for the 3 waters. So if we've got roughly a 30% drop off, we've got some degree of disproportionate impact there, because I suspect that most of our borrowing is not to do with 3 waters at the moment.
Correct.
That's to do with depreciation. And so what we're borrowing for are things like involvement with the ICL, museum, whatever. So in some ways we're going to get a bit of an imbalance here, aren't we?
There is a bit of an imbalance, and that's where the strategy becomes more important, and some of the modelling that will be shared with you later in the year will become important as we look to see what it looks like on a rebalanced. We will be doing both scenarios.
Sure.
May I ask? Just to calibrate the numbers a little bit, though, because I may be completely wrong in this, but as I understand it, it's not quite true to say that we inherit the debt, but we inherit the interest in our share of the debt, don't we? So we would have to pay our share of the interest on the debt. So let's suppose our share of the interest was 100 million, just for argument's sake, and that 100 million was 5% interest, and that's $5 million a year divided by 30,000 houses, which is like $150, if my math is correct. So it's not thousands. I'm not saying it's good. 150 is a lot of money to some people, but just to calibrate it, I mean, I might be completely wrong in that math. Am I?
I think you are.
No, I think you are.
You think I am?
I think you're way wrong, yeah.
But how? Because that's what the math says.
Okay, so the DIA advice, DIA advice is that Auckland's current water rates are about 800, and 10 years from now will be 800. Our rates are, as Rangi said, about 800 and something. By year 10, it'll be up around the 2,000. Some suggest 3,000, but I've seen figures around 2,200. So up 200 and something percent in 10 years. So it is significant. And to me, it's because of the need to invest. That's one issue, which is the global picture of the 180 billion they're talking about over 30 years. But the other issue is we will cross-subsidise other councils that are not in such a good position for us. So we will not be servicing our debt of 14 million. We'll be servicing a whole lot more.
Yeah, it's a terrible pun, but there's a lot of water to go under the bridge. Russell,
we do have a say. We have a say in October.
So now we just want to run through, I guess, the three big chunks of the infrastructural strategy, which is the key of what today is really about. And the first part is about how do we confirm our approach to network management. And when we're talking about network management, remember we're talking about stormwater, sewage, water, flood protection, and roads. That's what we're dealing with. So Patricia, so we've got that, plus I'd like to talk a little bit about our approach to what the 3 waters direction will be, and then the last section is about what are some of the key decisions, and that's that we will need to make sure that the strategy directs us. And I guess this is where it helped directs our technical people to make sure we're approaching this in the right way. So that's really what today's about, is are we dealing with this at the right strategic direction rather than some of that detail. So what I've tried to do a little bit is, hopefully, is to actually have some different colours. So in the next slide, I think there's some. So really what I'm trying to look for here is about our fundamental approach to our networks, that our high level position is that we continue to maintain our asset base. So we're not necessarily looking to grow our services out in a wider context across our city boundaries. Whether that be the right strategy or not, but that does mean that we're not necessarily racing out there to increase where we deliver sewage to, where we deliver water to, because we do have areas where we have within our district plan and other documents where we service and which places some opportunity in, I guess, extra problems for people to subdivide some of those areas. So I guess it's about us maintaining what we've currently got. We've talked about this morning, we haven't got a population that's growing, so why do we need a bigger network? Our networks were sized in the 70s for a potentially, bigger population than we've currently got. So we've been fortunate for the last 20 plus years, in my view, that we've been able to consume some of that extra capacity, and therefore we haven't had to do what many of the growing cities have. As soon as you put the pipe in, you've got to start planning for the next one because it's not going to be big enough. So our growth forecasts and our population will be part of that driver. So our assumption is that we will only maintain what we've really got. It's not necessarily a hard-coded, but it is really a core direction. So if we want to do something elsewhere, somewhere else, then that's the direction we're looking at that level. For instance, if we want to supply water to perhaps a community, let's just say perhaps Otatara for no other reason than a conversation, then at the moment our plan isn't to do that. But if that's what the council sees as our future direction, then we would need to incorporate that into our future strategy so that we could produce a cost model. So that's the biggest basis of that. So at the moment we have limitations in some parts of our community where the land lots aren't big enough to service sewage disposal. So in those places you can't subdivide sections. We've got limitations about where we've got different district plan zones, and I guess this is the overlap between where we have services and where we have a spatial plan with our planning colleagues about where we want the city to grow in, if we want the city to grow in. That's a really key element of our thinking going forward about how we deliver our infrastructural services.
My favourite, South City, Tramway Road, water supply. When are we going to look at building the reservoir there to safely deliver water to the places on Tramway Road that currently don't receive water supply? And I wonder if that is going to be either pressured one way or another by what happens with Te Puawai, because some of it is going to be supplied from existing thing, but when you come up Tramway Road, that will not be possible. What's going to happen then?
And I guess our water model will actually show where we can and can't deliver to, and I guess that's part of what we have in the district plan. We have a zone that says there's a red hard-coded land, that's pieces of land that says if you're inside here we will deliver water to you. If you're outside there you don't get water supplied. Just the same as we have for other areas where we've got zones that said you get sewage supply in there and are rated for them, and there are other areas. I think the solution for the wider issue in terms of water supply is closely linked with the alternative water supply and where that fits as a priority for the council in the end, and or its whatever future delivery mechanism there is for water, because at the moment we have a number of ring mains that go around the city that we have reasonable supply, but you are correct, there has always been a long-term vision to have a further reservoir down in the Sky Street area to actually supplement storage and delivery. But that's what the long-term future asset plan would deliver through the alternative water supply.
Nolly?
Yeah, the third area that you've got there, Russell, is probably the most important for me, which is a focus on the asset criticality. So regardless of which way the election goes, if we work on the assumption that Labor get past the next election and we have the water entities, why would we do anything in the period up to 2026 unless it was critical? Now, some councils have gone the other way. They've known that three water entities were coming, have jumped in and done massive amounts of infrastructure upgrades on the assumption that they would not be a priority when the entities kick in. So Queenstown's a good example of that. They've got growth, but they've been doing a lot of investment in their actual stock at the moment, which is right in the middle of Queenstown. Every second street's been ripped up at the moment. And the same for Dunedin. They knew that South City was probably not going to be a priority, even though it's got a climate change lens over it. So they've done a lot of work there as well. So they've got in on the assumption that they'll have some short-term pain on their rates because you have to service the debt, but it'll eventually go away to the entity. We've got the actual reverse of that. So what we've got is, why would we jump in at 2024, which is an option for us, with the Otago Southern cluster, and our ratepayers would then be subject to higher water rates, because that'll definitely happen the moment we jump into bed. Where in fact, if we listen to Brad Olsen, who tells us that the current cost of living pressures on families is likely to lessen in the next 18 to 24 months, so up until about 2025, 26, we get some relief then. If we then jumped in with the Otago South and at the latter part of that, which is 2026, we're keeping the pressure off our ratepayers in the interim. Now, the downside of going in late is that we've become very unpopular. I've already said to some of my colleagues that we're not keen on jumping until we know what the election delivers us, but I think we'd be mad to jump in early anyway. But most of the other big players on Otago Southern want the early entity because they get rid of their debt. But you've got to ask the question, why do they want to get rid of the debt? And that's because they're struggling to service it, and therefore we will subsidise that. So I guess to me that's the real hard question in there. Certainly my view would be that we hold out till closer to 2026 because that gives our ratepayers some relief.
For you, Chair, hadn't we already resolved that? Nobby, I thought we had already decided as a council that we would hold off.
We have, but our hold off was really till we knew where the landscape was election wise.
Right.
And so post election we will need to reinforce that, because I think under any model that we go into with the Otago South and we will cross subsidise out. I mean, Michael will tell you that we're in the best financial position on three waters of all the councils in Otago South. So the only benefit that comes of economy of scale for us is there will be economy of scale for some, but all they're doing is just taking the existing debt and spreading it a bit thinner. And so there are benefits for Queenstown and Dunedin in particular. Disadvantage for us, disadvantage for Central Otago that's got water meters.
Yeah, Russell.
Mr. Chair, if I could just run through the rest of those, and I'd like to come back to that question because it raises a really key, because the points I've got up there are about how we focus on how we develop our plans, and those plans deliver the future direction, which includes your budgets going forward. So the LTP is actually based around coming up with a plan. So this is how we address our asset development of our plan. So this is their core fundamentals. So, and if I could just run through them quickly, then we can have that question about criticality. So the basis of our presumption is that we actually renew our assets at the rate of consumption. So that is where the financial strategy sits across it. So if we actually we have enough money to renew on the life cycle. So in the past, we've actually, and historically, we have struggled. We haven't renewed as fast as we've been consuming. So we do actually have, in some of those situations, shorter times and no money in the bank, I suppose. But that's where our learned financial colleagues have a magic wand to fix those things for us. focus on criticality, and I guess what we're really saying is that some of our pipes in our networks are really important. So, for instance, our Branksome pipelines that bring the water from Branksome to our reservoirs are really key to us. So, if there was a problem with those, we would focus our works programs, and I guess that's the level we're talking about, to those. Whereas some of our other streets where we've got less problems or less consumers sitting off them, we might have to, our level of service on our delivery or our renewals, we might take more risks on some of those other areas than on some of our key things. And we've been doing that for a period of time, and you'll have seen some of the bigger renewal programs that we've brought forward. We need to make sure it is based on asset. We've got to have some good decision making, because otherwise we just don't want to randomly go out there and pick what we're doing by a specific number. We do need to actually look at our pipeline designs to deal with, certainly in our stormwater, about climate change and what that will bring. And I guess the LiDAR data helps us as a data source, but what we design for going forward is the issue. We've seen issues like in Auckland where they had rainfall events, which isn't, it's a rainfall event, not a flood, but it results in something, and it results on where the water will flow. And that's something that we don't currently model, and we will with the LiDAR. That's the next thing. But to model, I guess that is one of the things that we'll be putting up for consideration. To do the modelling, we have to fund it. It's not a cheap exercise, but to understand some of these things going forward and make use of that data, you need to commit into some of those projects to be able to get the right result. And I guess that understanding our community is one of those key assumptions. Where is our city moving? What is it doing? What's our population? Where is the growth that we need to match? And that's really key to all of our core infrastructure. And the bottom one is to strengthen our asset management. The smarter we actually have our team in-house, the better the solutions. I guess, and that's a challenge for all local government about how you keep, train, and your in-house teams are experienced in your networks, and actually, I guess, treat them with the stewardship that we need to carry on with. So they are the fundamentals of our asset management plans, and that's how we form our future budgets and our future programs from those. So if any time you ask us, you see something coming up and we're going to do something, you should be able to identify those things that are driving our decisions to be on the table. So.
Tom?
In my experience, depreciation rates usually take a fairly conservative view of the lifetime of an asset, and the whole point of the bottom dash point there, strengthen asset management, is that we seek to make the assets last longer using modern techniques that we have now, last longer than the age assumed. Depreciation may assume something lasts 10 years. You make it last 15 if you're smart in how you maintain it. And I kind of take from what you said there, Russell, that's what you are talking about. I guess all I'm saying is that, reinforcing that's absolutely what everybody does now. I mean, I don't know that anybody replaces the depreciation rate anymore, because with modern asset management techniques, you actually don't have to. You're smart enough.
Part of our valuation process and our renewal process is to actually establish what we believe are realistic asset lives, and we continue to push those to reasonably long lives. They're not short lives. Like, for instance, our footpaths, we have footpaths that we're planning not to replace between 65 and 80 years for a concrete footpath. So that's not a short life at all. So we know that our road surfacing, we have 18 years or thereabouts between reseals, which is probably one of the longest return periods for most councils. So be assured that our finance colleagues have made sure that we don't have too shorter lives. But you start to see that in the depreciation, which is a an assessment of consumption, and I guess that's the mix between the two is how close to that number are you? Because in any 1 year you won't, but in over any 10 years you should be getting to it, because we wouldn't want to find the situation like Wellington and other councils are, where they have probably pushed it a little bit hard and you start to see the consequence. Hopefully their pipes that are bursting aren't the critical ones. If they are, then they've got it completely wrong.
So a couple of things about that. Like, you wouldn't want to stop doing renewals for the next 2 years. I mean, you could, and just respond to failures, because in my lay terms, I think it doesn't make much difference whether you dig a street up to replace it because it's got to the 75-year time frame, or whether you dig it up because it's spewing water into the street. It's still the same cost, and it's probably the same time frame to fix it. But the trouble is, if you don't do a regular pattern of maintenance and you stall it for a few years and do a whole lot less, when you do need to uptake, the people that are potentially going to do it have gone. And they're no longer there anymore. They've drifted off to work elsewhere, and then you don't have the capacity to expand. So that's one issue. And the other issue, which seems to be missing for me here, and was touched on by some of the others before, was the issue of water heading towards Bluff. So we got the Calder Stewart announcing in the last couple of days a big industrial park there. We've got hydrogen down there, and we've got a significant need for fresh water for salmon farms, and certainly the aquaculture that's sitting in and around the freezing works. So I understand, Russell, you can confirm otherwise, that our current capacity to get water down to Bluff is at its peak. And so whether our alternative water supply needs to kick in and direct some water that way, but it'll require some infrastructure as well.
So, Mr. Chair, you're correct. We will need, if we have significant development towards Bluff, then we will need to ensure that we have more ability to deliver to Bluff. But once again, I guess that's that quandary of the who pays. If it's a development, is it and over what period? So long as we understand how we can deliver it, and when and what the lead times are the key issues there. And the alternative water supply and how you might manage and deliver that, and what that might mean, will be part of a wider picture. But we have enough water supply generally to satisfy what we're currently doing. If we have growth in some of those areas as part of that growth strategy, then you need to be able to deliver the solution. Perhaps just jump to the next slide. It's probably.
Hang on, Rangi, did you have a question related?
Oh, look, it was purely about the comment about concrete footpaths lasting 70 years. Like, I run every morning, and seriously, the concrete, because they're done in sections, you don't have because obviously they pour it and then they pour the next bit. It's just a disaster. Seriously, all right round where I run, it's just the concrete. That's why I run on the road, is that they're either subsiding, so they don't align the two blocks, or they start crumbling and cracking. So I don't know. I just, the 75-year comment really sort of gets into me a wee bit, that I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it at all. In theory, maybe, but in practice, absolutely not. So that's just sort of have to chuck that one in.
Thanks, Forrest. Russ?
Or just a quick reflection on what Russell just said about signalling the future of who would provide. I think that's really important, because some industries will or will not come here unless they know they've got the security around water, just as they want the same security around energy as well. Now, I know if you talk to the hydrogen people, Woodside are quite open to helping with that development of the infrastructure. They're open to that. But other players like the salmon farms may be working on assumption that it'll just be available. And if we suddenly change the landscape and say, well, there's got to be some sort of joint venture to bring it down.
Everything's available for a price.
Yeah, that becomes an issue if we want economic development.
Russ?
So this was really about is really about the three waters. So from an asset management perspective and the infrastructural perspective, as the affordable waters becomes clearer about what's going on, we have to consider how we have asset plans or or how do we actually present information that will be able to be fed into the long-term plan, which will actually be acceptable through the audit process. And this is really just giving you a heads up about there's two options that we're currently being proposed that we can proceed on and do our own asset management plans for the 30-year period as we would have normally done, and develop the next 30 years of what we think needs to happen. Or the NTU have suggested that they will have a more generic plan later after Christmas that will actually have our first 2 years. And the key element here, and I think this is where is really quite important to us, is that we are of the understanding that Entity J, which is the entity we will be planned to be part of, will take the program which we propose for years 1 and 2 and put that into the program. So years 3 to 10 will be in terms of the NTU's program. So whatever council decides to do in years 1 and 2 will be what goes on. So that's 24, 25. And then for year 3 will be that. And the last statement is probably the piece that's there, is that the NTU looks for significant decisions, but they've also used a term that I thought was interesting, is no gaming. What does no gaming actually mean? But what that actually says is that all councils will have different priorities for different projects. So if we had 3 projects that currently are on our box, and they could be for anything, and we would, as officers, would bring them to the council, and the council would decide to put them in order and which ones you would do. How you strategically decide which one you want to do could actually be dependent on whether or not the new entity would actually see the same priority as you do in 2 years' time. So you may well think, well, I'll do project 3. I won't do project 3 for 2 years because they have to do it in 2 years' time, and I'll get it anyway. And I'll commit to years 1 and 2, and then they'll be forced into do 3. So thinking about how all those things actually play out is, I think, what the bigger game picture is. But things like our alternative water supply, about where it's planned and programmed, may well be a priority for this council, but it may not always be the same priority after year 2 for the new entity. So it could well be that they see other development elsewhere in their entity as having a higher priority after year 2. So when you commit in terms of the LTP process, can have some really key long-term opportunities or strategic issues for the long-term community by making sure what you do. So,
okay. Rangi? Yeah, just want to support Russell's comments there, because when Nobby and I were in Dunedin listening to the DIA do the bit on 3 water at question time, we asked the DIA about 30-year plans and stuff like these for the entities, and he said no way would they have 30-year plans. They'd be lucky to have 3-year plans, but would be, from the impression I got, would just be fighting fires. They'd be, fighting fires as in going to the highest priorities and working down the list. And Russell's absolutely right that there would be no structure that we could visibly see to this new entity.
I know that a range of officers across councils have been working to form a 10-year financial forecast for the new entity, and that's to a certain degree a relatively unconstrained budget is what they were looking for. So that sort of puts lots of things on the table so that they can then see them in the whole entity as a whole, and then prioritise. Now, who prioritises those will be the challenge, of course.
Well, this is probably good news, rather, because the DIA didn't really have a clue about that.
Tom?
In terms of when we commit to the alternative water supply, and personally I see it's a high priority for the site, very high priority. But at the moment it's not being held up by council not making a decision. It's been held up by the fact that there's technical work to be done that we heard about last month, and that work's going to be done in good order before it can be brought forward. So is that start within 2 years actually a realistic proposition, even if we wish to, Russell, given the technical work, given the requirement then to get permits and work through Environment South presumably and do a whole lot. I mean, is it even feasible to even think about 2 years?
Mr. Chair, I'm not necessarily the expert in this field, but I think we would want to make sure that we would be as advanced and as far committed as we could be, if that's the council's desire to be in terms of its priority.
Nobby?
So just to reinforce what Rangi said, the structure with the entities, regardless of which entity it is, if the decision on priorities is not made by those that have votes on the entity, so it's not the 75% significance provision, which councils and iwi can vote on. It's actually with the board that's appointed to the entity that make the decisions. And I can tell you, when I threw up the alternative water supply and said, look, we don't have one, we're one of the few cities that doesn't have one, so we're at risk. And what do you need the water for? The debate I got thrown back at me was, well, your population's been static for decades, as Tom quite rightly says. You're talking about water which may predominantly be for industry and for economic development, with some pockets elsewhere. And on the other side of the equation, you've got Selwyn jumping from 7,000 population to 70,000 in 8 years, and Queenstown going the same way as well, and South Dunedin having climate change stuff. We will be way down the list, and that's a dilemma for us. That unless we can signal early and make it a high, very, very high priority, and maybe our only priority, we'll be left behind.
Yeah, it feels like that is the key thing we need to get.
And it really is
on with ASAP, isn't it? Is that alternative water source, be it for just a contingency or for economic growth. So I think that's probably what I'm picking up.
I guess the last section that will assist me completing my infrastructural strategy is about what are the key decisions that we actually are looking for from council. So, and Patricia will look to cover off how do we actually, our asset life for consumption, that's the funding issue. Are we actually looking to do as much renewal work as we actually consume? The climate change, we're really looking to just, I guess, be comfortable with that we continue to have the mid-range forecast, which is what we've been using in terms of the NEWA information. So that seems to be a reasonably consistent approach that's being taken by the councils. I think making sure we're really clear about what our city centre renewals, places, where does that fit in the timeline? I think we're currently developing a paper that will appear at the Finance and Projects that will help to give some direction in there. Some of the other bigger projects that will have some options in the infrastructural strategy is what are we going to do at Stirling Point. We've had it on the books as a community issue, but haven't necessarily been able to identify a feasible and sustainable option for the car parking issue and we'll put a range of options in for Stirling Point. We'll have there some conversations about opportunities for suburban places, and I guess that's where how do we refresh Bluff, South City, Windsor, those are sorts of areas which are outside our city centre, which have had some form of urban rejuvenation 20 plus years ago. What are we going to do with them in the next 30 years? Is that something we just have to reinvest as a renewal? Do we actually wish to look at some of the other areas of infill around our district where we've got, I guess, some growth, and also some of those land development areas which have been infill, but there's still areas to go which we currently can't easily service? Will we allow growth to actually give the district plan some extra guidance about where we want to do? Do we want to put other drains or water supply or footpaths or street lights into some of those areas where perhaps they're now much more urban than they have historically been, certainly in the next 30 years? And I guess that's the bottom one is, what do we foresee as some of the strengths for urban trends like in places like Otatara? Perhaps we'll just, there's a couple on the other page, we'll I'll put them all out there, and then Then we've got into some of the purple ones, which are the discharge consents, and we need to put up some options. And Councillor Pottinger is absolutely correct that the Clifton and Bluff discharge options are pretty key decisions in terms of our infrastructural strategy for us. For we'll have 2 years of influence, and then we won't have any influence. But certainly in the period of the next 10 years, those are relatively significant costs to our community, delivered by somebody. Doesn't matter who it is, but there are alternatives that we need to continue to watch. But at the moment, one of the thoughts may be a need to discharge to land could well be a future consent condition if we don't have other options. There's some further works on the resilience and redundancy of pipe networks. We've got some of those big pipes that we talked about, the criticality, that are sitting a little bit over the next 10 years, but perhaps they might need to be pulled closer to 1 or 2 to make sure they're in our mids. But we shouldn't hide from the criticality of some of our pumped sewer mains that are aging. They are singular pipes that we are very reliant on. For instance, Mersey Street's a relatively large pumped main that takes nearly 40+% of the city to Clifton. We are reliant on that pipe, and it's the only one we've got. So how we have some redundancy being built into the forward planning. If we were looking after this for the whole of life, you would see that on our program really early. But once again, Otatara, Lindisfarne and Russell Street are some of our key rising mains that are singular. Part of our infrastructure is that how do we make sure we've got contractors and funding with enough long-term signals so they can skill up to deliver it. And lucky but last on my list was our water tower that we've had many a debate on, but it's their own strengthen and manage. It is a part of our core infrastructure at the moment, and we'll need to transfer that. So happy to have a discussion on those topics, but I see those as our key issues that we'll bring back in our infrastructure strategy, is setting our direction.
So I've got a few. I think, Tom, did you have a question? Yeah,
Oh,
and then we'll go
yeah,
to Nobby.
thanks. It was on the previous page, but actually applies to several of those. I think when we think about, can we go to the previous page? I think when we think about things like asset life assumption, the key debate for council is really about risk appetite, isn't it? What appetite do we have for bus pipes or for, any other, for breakdown? Are we prepared to take the risk of breakdown? And I think the having had that debate, council viewing that, I think then feeds into officers saying, well, in that case, that means we have to assume this asset life condition. So what I was responding to, I guess, was thinking about how on earth would a council, other than us having different views, Leslie says 20, as I say 25, without any basis. It really is about risk appetite. I think that's where I think that's where you get the rich conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Nobby?
Yeah, just a couple of things for me. I guess this is a lot of this work we're doing at the moment is built on the assumption that we'll be in an entity at the end of the day. And we shouldn't just be planning for that, because we could potentially, with a change of government, not be in any entity, just stand alone. So we need to be mindful of that. Whatever decisions we make may leave us with council doing business as usual. Some other way of funding some of the work. The other issue that's not there is how we structure our district plans, because we've got some restrictions around the district plan about where things can and can't be. And that includes certain areas that you can and can't build in or subdivide in, or areas where we might want to intensify housing. And it's interesting when you consider that we've got a static population, that we still have a growth of new builds, that people want to live in better suburbs. And I think part of that is because if you leave your housing portfolio static, you get a deterioration at the bottom end. So I guess part of our stock is getting to a stage where it's not all that good. So you end up with one or two scenarios. Somebody comes in and buys an old shitter of a bloody place, I guess, and flattens it and builds something new, but they're still building it in a street that doesn't look all that good. Or whether you go off to a subdivision and try and build 20 or 30 houses that might look pretty sharp. And so the other issue you had up there was the issue you mentioned about Otatara and enhancing services. Look, I mean, as you know, I live in Ototara, and I'm not connected to sewage or water. Why would we spend any? Why would it be a key decision to put water into Ototara, even though it is 1,500 houses, which is quite substantial? Because the status quo is actually okay. Really is. I mean, they'd like to have fresh water, because sometimes your tank water runs out, but it's not the end of the world. There's a lot of other priorities we've got beyond that, I would have thought.
Evelyn?
Yeah, just so that I have a clearer understanding of what the other impacts of infill housing is. So obviously there's water and sewage, but that would also include electrical services and perhaps a little bit more lighting, perhaps a change to roading ingress and egress, things like that. Are there any other things that we should be looking at infrastructure assets for if we do go down the infill housing intensification?
It's typically your ability to actually dispose of your sewage. You know, normally your water is relatively straightforward to deliver. And road, we've got lots of capacity in our road network to be able to accommodate more cars or bikes and people walking and buses.
Ring.
Oh, just replying to Nobby's comments about Ototara, and I'm quite happy with that sort of comment, but unfortunately we're getting requests from people wanting to subdivide sections of Ototara that have already town supply on them, and they're only designed for, remember, one house. They want to put 8 in that large section. Now, the pipe system out there was only ever designed for a minimal amount, and so people are wanting and are wondering why we're not letting them go ahead. So this is where Russell's coming from. He's looking to the future. Well, there's people asking for these increased services, so we can just play hardball and go no to all these requests, or take it one step further and say, is that demand there? So, look, there's two sides of the story on that one.
Okay, thank you, Darren.
Thanks. Here's the other side. A number of years there have been people who've decided that, you know, shifting to Ototara would seem very desirable to them, and they get out there having lived in the city and they miss all those services that they had, and they suddenly think, oh, why can't we have footpaths? Why can't we have street lighting? Why can't we have rubbish collected? Why can't we have connection to sewage and water? And so there is always that increasing pressure that comes from people who've made a decision and maybe they've not necessarily thought everything through. But from the why can't you add just a little more? In resource management terms, it's a really common request, but it is actually limited by the capacity of the infrastructure. I mean, ultimately, if you keep stretching something, it's going to break. And if you keep adding more houses to the pipeline, everybody else is going to lose water pressure, and you have a whole lot of people. I mean, I get that somebody wants to add, and there might be a way that you can add an additional property into a subdivision, but it might be a part of the requirements that it is not connected to services. This is not new. This is something that is just business that we have to deal with and assess each one on a case by case based on the capacity.
Erin, did you have something?
If that's okay.
Yeah, get in.
I just want to make sure that we've got all of the information to think about whilst we're making decisions. Probably 2 points that I'd make is just around the pipe network side of it, is that Council, through the long-term plan workshops, has put an action on the infrastructure team to look at areas where infrastructure could enable greater levels of housing to be potentially achieved. This is obviously one of those things where the infrastructure strategy and the approach that we have taken has been around not enabling that. We haven't been looking at a growth strategy for Invercargill. We've been looking at, we're currently this size, actually potentially we're going to lose population, so no, we're not looking to try to achieve greater housing. I guess what I'd say is if we continue with that approach, that may be one of those outcomes, that we're not maximising that ability for new housing that council may be seeking. So that's one of the ways we could achieve that. The other one is just around things like street lights and footpaths. And I'm sure, Otatara is a nice, easy example, but there's definitely other areas of the network as well that I absolutely understand people have moved to areas and they just need to accept the services that are there, which I don't have a problem with at all. My only concern is when we've allowed intensification of an area to the point where you've got large groups of school children walking through the dark on the edge of the road. That safety piece of council was aware there was a problem, there was a call for this potentially, and has council discharged its responsibility to make sure perhaps intersections are lit appropriately, there is somewhere for children to be getting safely to and from school, those sorts of things. So I guess this is something that I have asked the team to have a look at, because I'm aware that in my previous life at other councils, we had done a lot more proactively in those areas where, for one reason or another, intensification had happened, to then look at whether or not there was appropriate safe infrastructure in place to support that.
Yeah, good. Russ?
I think you also, what does 2053 look like? In 30 years' time, what does Otatara look like? Because whatever we do now, because in 1993, whatever we've currently got is what we started with. So we have an opportunity, and I guess that's the input into the infrastructure strategy, is what do we actually want it to look like? So.
It's a lot easier for us if it stays the same, but you may want it to look different.
Yeah. One point, and I think it came up on a couple of slides ago, was around your team. Can you go back a couple of slides? And keep going. At the bottom, the strengthen asset management skills in-house. So that's, you're talking to re-staff capability there?
It's about being a smart client and actually having the right skill sets across our organisation to be able to make sure we've got good decisions in a long-term sense. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, that's I think the thing that we, in a sense, the only thing we can truly influence is making sure we've got the very best people who are thinking through all these challenges and understand the cost of it, if it's depreciation or if it's, the alternative solution. That's the only way we're going to get the best outcome, in my view. So what are we doing around our capability in our infrastructure team to make sure we've got good succession, we don't lose the intellectual property we have around our assets if someone leaves or those sorts of things? Michael? Aaron?
Look, it's a real challenge for us. It's not so much about actually trying to plan for people who are leaving. We don't have the people in the first place, and some of the challenges through this LTP process have come to the fore in that we've sort of sat down and run some workshops around what are some of the different challenges and constraints that we see on the network, and whether or not we can appropriately make the best decisions based on some of those anecdotal challenges that we have. And we came up with a list far longer of asset management type data tasks that we needed to do before we could actually make informed decisions around what we needed to do from an investment perspective. It's a national issue, and we are slowly building the team, but it's not happening as fast as we'd like, and we are doing some work sort of with those national working groups around how we can try to build strength in that space.
Yeah, because I mean, I've just recently spent some time with Canterbury University, and the undergraduates there are such impressive people, and there's a great opportunity, I think, for us and with SIT to potentially look at partnerships during holidays, those sorts of things, to introduce young people to our organisation, but equally get the opportunity to have them come and stay. So I think we've got to be really innovative around that.
Thank you, through you, Chair. What I would add to that is that it's perfectly put up there with the very last two words, which is smart client. We have to be smart in both fronts of our recruitment in relation to what Erin just said, and yourself in relation to the resourcing that's out there, and making sure we're working with polytechs and universities or the education side to make sure we've got the people coming through. But the challenge is wider than that, because some of the work that we need is highly technical from that perspective, and we'll need to be smart about how we acquire that. That's not resources we'll keep on site at all times. We will buy that in from that perspective. So we know when you do that, that you don't retain that expert, but hopefully with the data that we will improve on, we will be able to retain the data from that perspective. So the data becomes mission critical from our perspective.
Yeah, it's key, I think. Tom? Yeah, Tom. Yeah.
What I thought you were heading towards there, Michael, and you never quite got there, but maybe I'll take it. You know, in this day and age where we're prepared to have people sitting at home working on a computer, where the connectivity is such that you could really be anywhere in the world, then although I hate myself for saying this because we really want employment here, but it does seem to me that, you know, technical expertise can be housed anywhere, in fact anywhere in the world. And it might be that some of these highly technical roles, if we cannot recruit for them, it might be that we recruit to sit in Christchurch or Beijing to do the work. And I don't personally think that's necessarily a terrible outcome.
No, my point's more around the capability of the people we have working for us is going to be a critical success factor to how we meet the challenge, in my view.
Through yourself, Chair. I might just respond to Tom, because he would have been right, except for I don't think we've got the connectivity in our data, and that's why I didn't go there. You're right, I would have gone there. We need to do some improvement in relation to our data connectivity so we can actually share it a little bit easier. That is a focus of mine, and it's a focus of my team going forward, but that's going to take us a little bit to get there. And yes, that would be a long-term goal in relation to that. And I don't mean years and years and years. I'm hoping in the next couple of years.
Yeah, cool. Rangy?
Look, if we're looking at growth forecasts, I would have to say that Invercargill would have a reasonably optimistic one with the lifestyle that people are facing around the bigger cities, transport, taking an hour to get to work, and that would be that'd be a quick trip. I can actually see, just from what I'm hearing for colleagues talking around New Zealand, they are just quite happy to get out of the big cities. And hate to say this, but climate change seems to be benefiting Invercargill. It's not a positive thing to say, but in reality, we're all facing it. We're having the best summers. I think the portrait of Invercargill being the cold, damp place it used to be is certainly not there. And so if I was giving an opportunity to put a punt on population growth, and then I'd be right behind it to say that we must be planning seriously and so that the housing, the allocation of land, the infrastructure that Russell was talking about, we have to. We can't sit with a static sort of BAU. I think this is the time to do it, regardless of whatever fate Three Waters has.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Bobby?
Yeah, and just to reinforce that, we had a presentation by Anthony, who's the general manager of the Richardson Group recently at Mayoral Forum, and they're struggling to recruit as well. They've got about 300 vacancies, and we asked him why. He said the two big issues that prevent people coming here is quality of housing and the rental market's non-existent. And the other issue is the access to GPs and dentists. And people were actually turning away because of that. And I was surprised at the latter, because I wouldn't have thought that would have been most people's thinking when they were eyeing up a new job. Can I get a GP at the other end? But clearly that is the issue. And certainly the housing one was big, and we know about the housing. We've had it for 2 decades. So it's not just the quantity, it's the quality as well.
Yeah.
And these new industries, they're going to recruit people in mid-range and above, and they don't want to be sitting in some of the houses that we've currently got available. So we've got a challenge.
Yeah.
But the challenge could be smaller units or going upwards as opposed to going outwards.
Yeah. Right. We might bring that piece of it. You finished, Russ? Thank you very much for taking us through that, and appreciate your consistent work in this area. You're an invaluable asset to us, so thank you. We'll take lunch and then we're back at 1:30.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so 1:30 back in here. Thank you. please. All good to go. Okay, so welcome back to those on live stream. Second part of the session is with regard to the financial strategy. So Patricia's going to take us through that, and then we'll take questions at the end just so we get through it quite quickly. Councillor Sofa is leaving us shortly, so just feel free to go when you're able to, Leslie.
Okay. Good afternoon, councillors. So there's a similar sort of cadence to what Russell went through this morning. So again, we've listed out what our key decisions are in relation to the financial strategy. So I've already gone through what we're required by law to put in our financial strategy, but there's some pretty key assumptions that will underpin it. So probably the biggest one, or the two biggest ones, of course, are, and we'll go through these in detail further through. So we've got our inflation and our interest rates. As Russell alluded to this morning, we've got to look at that, how we fund our infrastructure approach. Also in relation to, we've always put in a capital program delivery assumption into our strategy as well. And then we look at affordability and our balanced budgets and making provision for a natural disaster. We'll get through to that. That's already been raised this morning as well. So we go to the first one, inflation. So given that we have our LTP is a 10-year plan, so we're going to have to make some assumptions around inflation for the next 10 years, but also we need to put it into the infrastructure and financial strategies for 20 years beyond that. So there is some long-run assumptions being used here. And we'll do operating costs. We will also look at wage costs separately, especially for the first 3 years, and then more, and as well as our capital inflation. So these are expected in October. I've made the comment there that they'll be higher than the last LTP was projecting. They'll probably be about double. We will, so they will come with assumptions with and without water as well. So what would our inflation look like on the local government cost index if local government has water, if local government doesn't have water? So that will allow us to give us some better assumptions. And Burl undertakes this exercise for the sector, and they develop the local government cost index. So they have said that they will give the two options this year. In relation to interest rates, we've got to do both what we think our borrowing will be and also what cash holdings. And I'll remind councillors that we said we would maintain as part of our management, our debt management strategy and our liquidity strategy, that we would hold 20 million in cash for liquidity purposes. And that also shores up our balance sheet for both emergency and helps us with credit rating as well. And then the third assumption is on our capital delivery. Now the only reason we have this assumption is that everyone tends to put too much into the capital program, and it's a realisation that if I was to go borrow based on what the capital program said, that I might actually be I would probably over borrow most years. So where we have set it currently is that it's set at 85% of the renewal program. So your strategic projects are expected to be 100% delivered. Well, the year which the borrowing might sit in might move a little bit. If something is going to be 10 million, it's not use hundreds, 10 million, it'll be 10 million. The renewals were saying, well, we might, whatever we've got in for that renewal program, things could happen and things may not get delivered. So what we're actually saying there is only 85% will get delivered. However, if we said actually let's, as a strategy and as a council, that we would only put forward capital programs that are able to be delivered, we could adjust that assumption. It would be in a really great space as a council for us to get to where we knew we could deliver 100% of our renewals program.
I mean, it's quite normal to risk adjust capital programs because the reality is in any organisation, they never all get done. And in terms of projects, I presume the 85% is based on a historical average delivery. In terms of projects, if it too was based on historical average, what average would we have, percentage would in the, say, in the last 10 years? I bet it's not 100%.
No, it's not 100%.
Is it 50%?
It would be between 50 and 70. I'm looking at Russell because he's probably got a better thing. My history here is much shorter than Russell's. It's, as a sector, local government's normally sitting in that 50 to 80. The good councils delivering 80, I would say. Some of them are going to 90. But we've taken, rather than looking at historically, looking at how we are currently organised to deliver our capital. So we have a PMO to deliver our strategic asset, those strategic projects. So that is their core function. That's what they've been charged with. So that's, I'm quite happy with that. It's whether we can get from 85 to 90 or 95 with the other ones. But that's until we start seeing, that's one of those last assumptions that we've got to play with. The other really key issue is funding infrastructure. At present, I've taken a very traditional approach here, that we fund by rates or we borrow. There are other ways that are coming and emerging in the sector, but I think from a long-term strategy, we are best to say, well, yes, there may be other ways, but let's focus on what we've got here and now, and maybe we can change to something else as it comes through. It's hard to know what the other funding mechanisms will be until they arrive. So this is all prefaced around who is the best person, who is best placed to pay? Your users now or the users over time? So currently we're funding the renewal of existing assets via rates using depreciation as the proxy for its consumption over the life. That does get adjusted by revaluation, so we know that what was probably, go back to Russell using 1993, 30 years ago to replace a section of footpath versus that same section of footpath today will be very different. And so therefore, as we go through an inflationary period, the cost to replace those assets goes up. With new and improved assets, our strategy has been to debt fund those and then rate for the interest cost and the debt repayment over 25 to 30 years. Apologies for the spelling mistake. The other option that we've got is to rates fund via renewals. So we come up with a Russell, and between the infrastructure strategy and the financial strategy, we come up with a renewals number per annum, and we fit the renewals program into that number. And we rate for 15 million of renewals for the council, or 10 million. And we got 10 million every year of asset renewals, and that's what we rate for. Very blunt, but it is another way of doing it. However, there is the risk that you get 20 years into that such a strategy and you have a significant inflationary period, you may not have enough. You're not going to deliver 10 metres of footpath for this. You might not have enough money for your 10 metres of footpath. And the new and improved, I've still kept it, other option is still to debt fund it, but you might go closer to the 30 years or we go to even longer. Let's say actually we do our capital repayment over 40 years. So that's sort of the quandary that we're at, and when we bring the financial strategy back, I may actually do it with both options of renewals if that's what you are, that if you want to see what the difference will be, we have to do it as a long term, what the difference would be between those two.
So if we rate funded via renewals, Russell, how good's our information to be able to accurately assess what our renewals needs to be? Because you don't want to be, if you go down that track, you don't want to be under investing, do you?
Mr. Chair, I think that's one of your risks, is that your data information is reliant, and I think you try to do both. You're trying to understand what your consumption is, because your base life is what you need to be looking at. I think one of the problems we face is that we're actually a lot of our assets are 2/3 of the way through their life already. So part of the challenge that we face is that we don't want to replace things by age. We want to replace them by need, and I guess that's the challenge of actually being able to find. And it's much easier in footpaths because you can see the things. Yeah. A pipe's a bit more difficult, and we've got some of those big lumps coming. People talk about a bow wave of things happening. The thing is that your general engineering people will try to smooth it out. That's the general nature of what everybody tries to do. But somewhere in time, it does start to catch you up. And e.g. Wellington has a problem with their water pipes. Fortunately, I think we've avoided some of those things because we've been ahead of the game. But we had some really strong peaks of construction in the 50s and 70s in our city, and when they come to the end of their life, they will come to the end of the life about the same decades, and that will actually challenge whether you can afford to fund the amount of renewals of those periods at that time, and that's your downside. Other than that, you've got to force sometimes you've got to say that's our strategy, but we actually have to go up 10% in the preceding 5 years or something along those lines. But it is actually and we have to do better than 85%.
Yeah. Bring in then, Tom.
Yeah, look, it was just a question also around is the quality or the technology of our infrastructure improving just by suppliers? Like take for example the massive stormwater pipes out at the end of D Street there. Are they a better pipe than we would have had 10, 20 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the materials we're using now are generally of a much higher, like for instance, the standard of a concrete reinforced pipe compared to an earthenware or a 1950s concrete pipe is just magnitudes are different, but that's allowed for in the future.
So this is all being allowed for by the manufacturers. Yep. So is it the manufacturers that give you the life, or how do you?
They give us a suggestion, but then we typically are extending that, because it's a bit like you turn up and you get a new roof on your house and you ask the roof supplier how long with the roofing material, and they'll say warranted for 7. You might get 15, and everybody replaces it at 30. So how long is it? And that's, we've got materials there that we continue to sample and look at what the failure mechanisms are and what's causing that on a year-by-year basis, and continue to update that information about what it is, that when can we see the trend happening, and if we can push the life out, we will push the life out. But that's the challenge. If you've got a renewals budget and we've got to spend it, otherwise we won't get to 85% from our accounting friends.
No, that's good. I mean, my main question was about the improvement in technology, which increases this gap.
Yeah.
And it's another one where as the data through gets better, we can get better at doing this as well.
Yeah. Understanding the contingency. Tom?
I think I was probably just going to reinforce what Russell replied in response to Rangi's question, and that is that, critical to this is very, very good asset management programs and, understanding predictive models. The reality is that why spend an extra $2 million a year in replacements when you could run an asset management program, say, for $500,000 a year that would avoid that? And therefore, I think we've got to be prepared to invest in that kind of, because that is how you actually push out don't replace it 10 years. If you judge that you can replace it 13 or 14 years, that's got a lot of value, but you're taking some risk. But if you've got very good asset management programs, you can mitigate that risk just by good analysis. So, I think we've got to be prepared to consider programs coming forward for spending on asset management predictive models, which will allow us to do these things.
Sometimes a failure isn't a bad thing because you've actually got pretty close to the line, so long as it's not critical. And I guess that's the criticality of those pipes, that you need to make sure you've got your house in order, that you don't have that risk. So you take risk where it's appropriate, and that's, I guess, why historically we've looked at some of the things like footpaths and agreed that we might not necessarily fund those fully at the depreciation rate, because we can do some minor repairs, we can look at them, we can, you can see some of that stuff. But would I risk water supply or some of your rising mains? No, that's where you should. That's where the investment logic applies.
So with their asset management programs, what, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good are they, in your opinion?
You're asking the strategic asset manager, so that's a bit. It's like asking.
I've got the right man then, haven't I?
Sending the wolf into the hen house, all right? I think we continue to learn. We are. Part of that is we have an asset maturity, and I guess that's part of what the rest of the asset triangle looks to have is, so where do we want to be, and how do we want to continue to improve? So some of our stormwater and Falsura and our water plans and the roading plan are probably more mature than some of our other plans. Our property and our parks, I guess, are just a little bit behind the data cycle because, to be fair, Wakakatahi's paid for the data from roading for a long time. So, we've got lots of data, we've done lots of the deterioration modelling. A lot of that's coming into the three waters, and obviously that's where that's being driven from. But we're still continuing to race behind to catch up on those other programs as a whole of council, because I guess the infrastructural strategy deals just with the pipes and roads we talked about, whereas Patricia's talks about this is funding the whole of the rest of the council asset base as well. So short answer is we're probably in an intermediate stage, not at a high level yet. So, but that's our target, and that's why we want to continue to invest in our staff and our programs.
So when we get a paper back, that will address how we might beef up our asset management capability, and through the use of programs and those sorts of things. Like that's going to be.
That will be included within when we start getting to LTP budgets.
Yeah, good.
And that certainly is the opportunity. I know that we've just recently been working through some of those, and be fair to say the infrastructure teams look reasonably liberally about the opportunities that it faces, and we'll wait with bated breath about what the decision is on some of those projects. And some of it is modelling.
Yeah, thank you. Nobby, and then Evelyn.
Yeah, just two or three things. Patricia, you mentioned the $20 million hold for liquidity. Are you talking about money that's currently sitting in our banks?
Yeah, so currently that is part of our cash reserves, that we would keep $20 million as a liquidity buffer.
So currently about 40, give or take some change?
Yeah, because we've got some short-term debt.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other issue was the issue which Russell was just talking about our appetite for failure as opposed to maintenance, doing asset management going forward. A couple of things to consider, I guess. One is that new technology will change the landscape for us. So it's not just a matter of saying let's have a 10 or a 30-year plan. Good example is in Queenstown when I was there, they were boasting about the fact that they've got a new pipe sealing piece of apparatus out of Watercare in Auckland and hadn't given it back. So what it basically does, when you had a damaged pipe, it sort of drills it out, and as it goes, it puts a silicon seal around the pipe, so you can actually extend the life if you've got a bit of not just a pipe that's gone past its final date, but it's damaged where you would normally rip it up and replace it. So that sort of technology is on the horizon, I guess. And the other one would be the nature of the replacement, and I think somebody already asked us all about the issue, pipes, which might only be 75 years life now, might be 100 years, 10 years from now, the different materials being used.
Yeah.
So, yep.
That's good. Evelyn?
Just thinking about what you said about the 1950s growth and then the 1970s one, proportionally, which is the bigger risk? Is it the 1970s because it's so widespread? which you've got the whole of Centre Street, Regent Street, and then right across to Kingswell.
My recollection of the data is that they are similar, but certainly the technologies in the 50s weren't as superior as the technologies or the approaches used in the 70s. And yet again, we've actually probably done less new infrastructure since then, but what we're putting in is better again. So they're just really high peaks in terms of how much we physically did in those spaces. I mean, that's when you see the numbers, it's just quite, it's really big. It's peaky and just amazing the amount of development that must have gone on. But when it comes to an end, it is also something that you've got to fix.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, sorry, Patricia.
So just as what we've just been discussing, it's whether depreciation best reflects our consumption of an asset. And the other one is that linkage with the infrastructure strategy. So this is where these two strategies have to be joined at the hip for us to get a good outcome. The other really key issue is the key metrics we put in the financial strategy. And I look at this as the 4 key limits that we've got. So we have a balanced budget, which is a goal that we have to have a plan to achieve. We have a limit on rates increases, which is set in the financial strategy. A limit on borrowing. So that's what we've called our debt ceiling for the last 3 years. And our rates affordability, which is a goal of council. It's how we use those 4 things to get the right outcome, hence why they become a pyramid.
Yeah, could I just add to that a little bit? What's missing on that triangle for me is 2 other factors. One is that some new industry coming in may contribute, so that while we have some growth, it might be that we get some joint ventures going with some of the major industries who want to be here and secure their water in particular. And the other issue is post the election, if national, and they may very well have a contestable tax-funded pool of money that we can use. We'll probably get less of it than anywhere else, but that allows us to soften our rate impact going forward.
Yeah. Actually deal with that coming up.
How, in terms of new enterprise to the city, Russ, how early do they engage us in terms of their infrastructure needs? Is it too early, too late, or about right?
Generally, it's reasonable, but it tends to be on the later side. Often they talk on a very high level until they can actually establish that they can secure their funding, and often that funding for their projects are relatively towards the end deadline, because I guess that's the challenge, and often they will bring to us generalizations about what they're looking for. It's not often deadly specific and nailed down, and then we have to do the rest of the work in behind it. So a lot depends on what each one is, and how often we get them, and how much resource we have to actually put up that process.
Tom, have you got any insights there around big?
Well, I guess. I mean, if you look at electrical infrastructure, where you get a new business coming in, they want to set up, and it's going to require new transformers, and substations, and so forth. They have 2 choices. They can either fund it themselves, and then they don't pay the same, ongoing charge, or else they can have the lines business, it usually is, fund it. But then they pay it back over a period of 25 or 30 years. Effectively, it's a loan that's given by the infrastructure company but it's still going to be paid back. And usually the decision, if they're smart about it, depends on who's got the lowest cost of borrowing.
Yeah.
That's if they talk well enough to each other, it depends on that. But if you look at electricity Invercargill, nearly everything's funded by electricity Invercargill, then recovered through line charges. If you look at the power company, quite a substantial amount of their work is actually funded by capital contribution by the business.
Right.
because it's usually way out in the wild someplace and you've got to put in a whole lot of infrastructure. So they pay for it, then they don't pay line charges.
Right.
And I don't know whether we've got that same option.
We've had a number of, we've got a few pipelines where they are single industry use predominantly, or perhaps there's a little bit of city stuff goes into them, but they get funded by the industry and invested. It's no different than a subdivision in effect. When someone builds a new subdivision, they pay for the whole infrastructure, everything, and then they vest it in terms of council, and then we take over that and then we maintain it ongoing. But I guess in most of those situations we get that ongoing nature because we also can claim rates across those people. So it's, if you had huge subdivisional and extra work, then you would actually start to see increased maintenance costs and other factors that you wouldn't. But one of the things we've been really fortunate is we've actually had capacity. When you think about my earlier comments, that there's actually been capacity in just about all of our networks to be able to either do the 1 and 2 lots or the bigger stuff. We haven't had the demands that some of the bigger cities have had, where you've got to replace a pipe because it's not, we haven't got stuff that's big enough. We're getting to there, but we have just about used our spare capacity generally in some places. But if they said, where would you put it? And that's what Aaron was alluding to, is where can we, if you said, where would we put infrastructure? We would say over there because the pipes aren't busy, so put it there. But that doesn't often always suit people.
Yeah. Rangi and then Nobby.
Look, I'm just, Russell, looking at the news article that where Calder Stewart announced their industrial park, and it says here, Australasia's biggest heavy industrial business park. And this is still obviously not in concrete yet, but if it goes ahead, can we handle it with what we've got, or do we? Is this a game changer for us?
Mr. Chair, I'm not
403 hectares.
I'm not fully aware of what their demands. A lot will depend what they put in there.
Yeah.
If it's heavy water
for the water stuff.
For water and waste, that's the tip. Typically, it's easy to find water because you have big sheds, you can capture water. It's actually how you manage the disposal of your waste, which seems to be the greatest challenge that everybody, both land subdivision and industrial, and that's where we will actually have that ongoing challenge ourselves as we have our.
So we haven't been approached yet.
I haven't been, but it doesn't mean to say that there's elsewhere in the council where it might be.
Okay, I mean, like, it's a great announcement, and it looks very real. It's just that,
yeah. And that's probably a bit of the challenge I'm alluding to is, we need to be engaged pretty early because of our plans, or at the impact on our planning and provision, and we don't want to not provide so they don't come either. So it's
equally that. We don't have to be the only people that actually treat waste and dispose of it. They may well wish, at the size of an industrial subdivision, they may well choose to come up with a methodology where they could equally do that themselves.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
If you take, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Nobby and then Tom.
The initial question was how early are people engaging and what's their thinking around it. Look, discussions I've had recently with hydrogen and data banks, and to a lesser extent with salmon, they all want security of water.
Yeah.
They're not worried about footpaths or roads or electricity or anything, which surprised me, that the water angle. And the key word there was the security, not just the water.
Yeah.
They don't want to invest, in some cases, billions of dollars only to find out they run short of water, which is critical for their operation. But look, it seems to me that these people are open to some investment in the infrastructure themselves, which is Russell's alluded to that, because certainly when I put it to Woodside about the housing, they said, they were quite chest puffed out, and we're going to have 2,000 workers here building the plant. I said, well, where are you going to house them? We don't have housing for 2,000 workers. And then they sort of said, well, how else could we deal with it? And I said, well, so they came up with a workers camp or two, maybe 300 houses transportable. And of course I then said to them, well, that's great. So what are you going to do with them when you finish with it? Because you only got 200 workers in the plant, so only a tenth of it. Don't know. I said, well, could you gift them to the city as part of your social license? And they were up for that. So that showed me, I guess, that they're wanting to be more than just a drop in and you provide everything and we'll bring the big plant along. They're quite happy, I think, in this day and age to get the security and and to invest a little bit in the infrastructure as opposed to just the industry they're in. So I think there's an option there for us if we get in early. So I think that's what Rangi's alluding to as well.
And maybe one of the things we look operationally is have someone on staff that is the key contact, so that we capture those connections and networks and get played through to Russell's department pretty quickly around what they're thinking and how we might manage it.
Yep. As opposed to waiting for them to come and put a consent in.
Yeah.
To get somebody on the front foot as soon as we hear something's going on, make the contact first.
Yeah. Yep. Alan, you keen on that?
Very keen on that.
Good.
Always been keen on that.
Tom, and then Evelyn.
You know, I was just going to say that for the largest capital investments, like, you know, the hydrogen plant, that might be, you know, $3 or $4 billion or something like that by the time you know, modify the port and unloading and all that sort of thing. It'll be billions of dollars. And I would expect, you know, based on, you know, other projects like that I've been involved in, they would assume that they would provide their own infrastructure. I would expect.
Yeah.
I would expect them to put in bores, or, you know, they will assume that in their capital estimates.
Yeah.
And if they can persuade us to take some of that off their hands, then they'll be delighted at that. But I would expect if there's somebody sitting somewhere at the moment and Woodside doing a capital estimate, they will include the cost of those things, and I'll be absolutely certain they will.
Well, I think what they were saying was that, Tom, was that they were saying if we're doing some drilling at the moment, and when we were doing the drilling before, it was on an emergency water backup. And if we now wanted at the front end of part of our supply, they'd be prepared to be involved with that.
Well, ECA could be in a like idea of, you know, the water that comes out of the wastewater. You know, we could pump that down to them for cooling, and it doesn't have to be, you know, consumable level.
No.
But it could be a great way we can do a partnership with them and say we actually solve a problem together.
Yep.
And I think that's the sort of thing I think we should really be trying to bring forward.
Yeah, it's called potable water.
Yeah.
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 And the data banks want exactly the same thing.
Yeah, so instead of them just doing their thing over here, you know, maybe we can solve a problem for each other by working more collaboratively together. So that'd be great to see. Anyway, Evelyn.
I think that we need to be really clear on what we will provide for those huge big activities as opposed to our business as usual. And I think it comes back to the conversations that we've had about subdivisions and in places where we don't currently have reticulated service and all those sorts of things. You want to have your subdivision, we're not going to provide the service. That's, you know, that's the bottom line. It's outside of our reticulation area. We don't encourage you to subdivide there. If you want to do that, you have to provide your own water sources, disposable sources, all those sorts of things, and it all has to fit within the legislation, because I think otherwise we get pushed into chasing these developments and over capitalising the city or over committing the city.
Oh yeah.
You know, if we're sending the signal we're open for this, but these are the things we will not do, or these are the things we cannot do, and then people are within no doubt. We've been talking to Datagrid, and one of the things we said to them was, you're in an area, theoretically, where the aquifer's under a little bit of pressure. What are you going to do in terms of your development to not put further pressure on? And they'd already thought about that. So Tom's exactly right. They're making big capital investments, and they do the what ifs. What if I can't get water? And then at the other end of it, how do I dispose of it once it's been through our system 7 times or whatever I think they said the maximum number of cycles is. You know, so I mean, we don't have to take it all on ourselves, and we shouldn't take it all on ourselves. And the signal which we should be sending to people is, we really are interested, but you have to build in your own independence, because this is not within the capacity of the city ratepayers to do it for you.
All good. Sorry, yeah.
Just and only because this council hasn't come across it before, so you might not even be aware of it. But the other bit that council lever it does have is development contributions.
Yeah.
And it's something that this council has always shied away from because it's always felt that that was an incentive to get development. But you might find that if that's switching and you're getting a big bow wave of development, you might find that you might want to reconsider that position because it does relieve that pressure that you otherwise
So
have.
what was it called again? I missed the stuff.
Development contributions.
Development contributions.
So we do have both development and financial contributions, slightly different. But
I thought we couldn't do one of those.
you can do development contributions because you tend to do them because they're putting pressure on, whether it's community, and you have to give them back. There is some other ways that if it's industrial that you see as the pressure that's going on the system, that there may be a way that we could come up with something.
You need to make the call as to whether or not they need to be in place. You can't put them in place once you've received the application.
So now is the time. So I'll add that in the comeback as well.
Yeah. Russ, you
development contributions, I guess, for bigger projects can be by agreement. I would see that it's because it's a contribution. It's a mutual agreement. Often development contributions are where you've got a subdivision, for instance, for a gravel road, and people will pay a little bit early. But what you do tend to find is that there's a break point where three people have paid the development, then you've got to do the rest and wait for your money to come back. And often that's seen to be it's a long and painful process, to be fair. And I guess council some while ago considered that and considered it wasn't necessary at the time because we were trying to encourage people to do growth. It's actually an inhibitor in some places. Some councils have quite, I guess, expensive costs to join networks. And typically, if you might join a sewer or a water network for just a simple subdivision, it could be several $1,000s. In some of the places in Auckland, I know it's tens of thousands of dollars per utility to subdivide your residential property into
You probably find, Chair, a comment on that, it's different when you've got 3 or 4 people putting in a gravel road to a little subdivision, but if we are talking about a hydrogen plant, a Woodside or something like that, they would expect to provide these things. They would expect it, and they will be gone. Almost certainly they'll end up using Chinese money. I suspect they'll be borrowing at 1 or 2%. They'll not want us to do something and end up paying it back to us if we're borrowing at 5 or 6%. So, that tends to be how these big projects think.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so the key metrics. So traditionally we've always used net debt. And I'm proposing that in the financial strategy, we continue to use that net debt construct, which, if you think about it, it's a revolving credit facility for each activity. They say they might go up, they might go down, they pay interest, and the council is the bank. So that's the way to think about when we talk about net debt. Some will make small surpluses, but then the next year they may need to use that surplus because of the timing of projects, things like that. The one change, and I know the Mayor said that we didn't think there needs to be too much that changes in the financial strategy. The one I'd like to consider is, rather than concentrating on a debt ceiling limit, or how much we could borrow, we focus on how much we can afford to service. And we set that level based on, if the interest rate's at 4% or 5%, this is how much it's going to cost us, this is the rates that come out. So it's a sort of like solve the equation backwards a little bit. So what's their maximum finance cost and how much borrowing does that actually allow?
Very prudent.
Yeah, good idea.
Question, can I just,
with
that option, does that potentially restrict us with our, say, infrastructure program, where we've mapped out a period of work to be done over a period of time? But if increasing interest rates on what we're already serving go high enough, could that impact the amount of work that we're able to do in the next year? And how would audit respond to that?
It could, but then when we developed this construct, we'd probably stress test it to see whether it does work. It may be that we have this discussion now, we go away, we model it, and come back and go, actually, it might not work. and we need to go back the other way. We always know that we'll be able to borrow, our headroom will be significantly more on the other way. But the concern with that is that the cost to service that debt, if we got towards that debt ceiling, would put a burden on our ratepayers because we don't borrow to pay interest.
Yeah. You'd be able to fluctuate your work with that, the rising and lowering interest rates anyway, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So one, you do less now, do more later,
Unless you've got a criticality.
As you all know, historically, it changes bi-yearly, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's not. It's like this forever.
Yeah, you get a sensitivity to how much rates, where they're at, and
where they're going.
And then at 8%, we can't do any other capital program.
Yeah, but then you do it all next year when it's 2% again.
Yeah. Bobby?
Just two things. When we talked before about development contribution, there is also the opportunity, especially in the hydrogen space, for them to reduce our costs. So we talked before about what happens if we have to do discharge to land, and how far would the piping be to get to a parcel of land that could take the discharge that we have every year. It'll be huge. So if, for argument's sake, if we could take the same waste down to wherever the hydrogen plant is and they get rid of all of it, we get nothing back at the end of that. Any discharge back at the end of it, that's a huge cost.
Yeah, that's right.
You hear a lot of these projects now not talking about that sort of stuff. They talk about social licensing. And so an interesting thing about social licensing, well, if we were putting some infrastructure, say a few $1 million worth of infrastructure from A to B, and that same company then put $2 or $3 million or whatever into a new museum, is that social licensing that has a good spin for us and a good spin for them as well?
Yeah.
But the other issue is the issue of these reserves that we keep having. And we keep talking about, I think somebody said to Russell before, how much of the CapEx do we do every year? Well, I can't comment on the Three Waters CapEx because I don't know, but certainly in the last 2 terms anyway, 3 terms that I've been watching council, we've not delivered what we said we were going to deliver. So it seems to me just about every year, but not every year, we run at a surplus. And for those who've been around, Darren and others will remember that about 4 or 5 years ago we had this debate about, hang on, we're putting $2 million into reserves, but we just put the rates up $2 million. It just didn't make any sense.
No, that's right.
And one of the cycles I think we get caught up on is that we predict our rate increases and bill for them even before the end of the financial year, so we get ahead of that. But our financial results don't come out till about September, October, by which time we realise we've got a surplus. And I suspect that, I don't know, those reserves that we've had in recent times have been up around the $50 million mark. Now that's just not not revenue that we've mystically found. It's where we've over quoted what we're going to use, and we've actually underspent. And for ratepayers, that doesn't sit all that well sometimes. I know it's good to have it for the net debt purposes, but there's got to be a balance somewhere along the line that we're not predicting, say next year, 5% will be $2.3 million worth of rate increases. It wouldn't be good if at the end of the year we were $2 million underspent and just put it aside. If we take it and put it into, I don't know, saving grace or something, that's another kettle of fish altogether. But there is that constant tension at the end of each year.
Yeah, 100%. Rangy?
Look, this rise in interest costs, affecting the infrastructure and everything, you completely understand it, but I'm just reading an article here about Southern District Council proposing massive rates increases, and their excuse is rise in interest costs on infrastructure. Now, and obviously, I thought you would have some sort of smoothing effect that would cover your borrowings and everything, so you weren't at risk or you could foresee or whatever. But obviously, the rates increases, when you correlate them back, the increases in interest costs to these guys must be quite phenomenal. They must, they're really exposed.
Well, they've borrowed $100 million to invest.
I think part of it is they've also looked to borrow so they can reinvest.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but anyway,
in the marketplace,
so they've exposed themselves.
But the direct impact is on.
Is that what you're suggesting we do?
No.
Well,
I'm just saying that if you're looking at interest cost fluctuations, which we know they're probably still increasing, is that they've obviously exposed themselves I mean, the rate increase is not like a 1% rate increase. It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
They've got an issue with a lot of their infrastructure hasn't been kept up for years, haven't they? Aren't they way behind the 8 ball?
No, it's purely referring to interest cost increases.
Yeah.
So if the interest hadn't gone up, it would be plain sailing.
strategy.
So this is just exposes what Patricia's raised here.
Yeah, we just need to be really good at forecast. Yeah, we're sensitising our debt position. Finding out the sensitivity. Tom?
I think we probably covered it before, but I mean the key to there's question marks against the second point. Is over what period do you assume? Because if you assume the rate that you look at in the newspaper that day, then you wouldn't be borrowing anything.
No, that's right.
But and it's unpredictable, it may be completely different tomorrow. If you make an assumption over 10 years, it's far more predictable, and it might be assumed 5% or something. So, I mean, my question would be, if we were going down that track, over what period, over what average period would you assume an interest rate?
So we look at the interest rate over the first 10 years.
15?
And then, but we 10 to 15, we look at it over a period and go, well, what's the average? But we also look at what's rolling off our own book. So at the moment, I think at April or March, our weighted cost of capital, cost of borrowing was about 2.3%, because we've got a lot of fixed debt at low. As we go through, we know that's going to roll off, and so what that new debt will come on at. So our rates will go up, but then we look at what that long run, and because we tend to borrow long, so we tend to borrow a lot of our big stuff at long periods, knowing that we're probably, depending on what we're borrowing for, affects that. So that's part of our liquidity management.
Right. So if we were doing that today, you're saying that over 15 years it might be, we'd assume an interest rate of 5% or something like that, finance cost?
Might be a wee bit lower than that.
A wee bit lower than that. So I mean, on that basis, I think that makes absolute sense, Chair, to do it that way.
Yeah. Okay. This is probably the other one that's going to be our biggest issue in the financial strategy, and that is a plan to come back to a balanced budget. And a balanced budget is literally that our total revenue is greater than our total expenses. But they do take out some revenue, gets taken out of the calculation. So any vested assets and all that, which is revenue, so creates an accounting surplus, but is not really revenue. So it's also the largest cost impacting this is depreciation. So that's why we have gone to an unbalanced budget for, as we've said, the LTP, the annual plan, will have an unbalanced budget because of how we've chose to fund depreciation. So we need to, over the course of the strategy, come back to within the LTP, coming back to a balanced budget position. So that will be one challenge when we write the strategy, is that this, to be prudent, we need to come back to a balanced budget. In isolation, the answer's easy, as I say. Yeah, increase your revenue or you decrease the expenses. In practice, trying to do that while trying to achieve everything else we want to achieve will be much more difficult.
As a third option is you increase your asset life assumption and therefore depreciate over a longer period.
Yes.
So how free are we to do that?
We can do that, though we do review that every time we do an asset revaluation. I was going to say every 3 years, but it's proving to be less than 3 years that we have to revalue assets.
But that is a valid option.
That is a valid option.
Because if we believe that through asset management, good asset management and better materials and so forth built over time, then the assets are going to last longer, going to last 25 years instead of 20 years, then that reduces by 20% actually your rate of depreciation. So that's a significant impact on the...
And the one challenge we would have by doing that will be to try and get it through audit.
Sure.
Because we'd have to be able to prove that that was already...
Yeah, that might be easier than increasing everybody's rates by 15% 1 year.
Yeah, but no, it circles back to your point, Tom, around the really good asset management programs, because that is the information we inform the decision to change your depreciation rate, right? So it goes back to we need to have really good information.
So, Mr. Chair, there's quite a range of guidelines that issued nationally and through the International Asset Management Manual, which is the baseline which we push to the right, to the far end. So we have not underestimated our asset lives. So we continue to have reasonably long asset lives, and where we've actually got any justification, we have tried to extend them out as far as we think are logical. Whether there's more evidence to support it is the problem, and often we're only in the first life cycle of our assets. If you think about that, our pipes have only had one life cycle in the road and in the ground, whereas our roads we've got a lot much more reliable because we've had several life cycles. So that's that balancing act of how we actually come up to a number that's appropriate.
Yeah, Nobby.
Yeah, I've seen this in previous occasions as well, but I think we have an unhealthy focus on a balanced budget. It's okay to be unbalanced if you know traditionally that you've actually ended up with a result that was surplus most of the way through a 5 or 10 year period, and it's built up our reserves because of that. So I'm not suggesting we go to unbalanced budgets every year, but there are times when you've got pressure on, and say for instance we've got pressure on now with the cost of living for our community, to actually run with an unbalanced budget that might show at the front end that we're going to run out of money towards the end, but in practice history would tell us that we're not going to run out of money, and we've still got the backdrop of the reserves sitting there, and quite healthy reserves at that. So.
Yeah. No, very much.
Okay, the other key issue that we have to look at is our reliance on and reliability of external funding. So this will become when the LTP gets audited. This is a key focus on audit. If we are putting in third-party funding, external funding for capital projects, is that actually going to be received? Waka Kotahi, because it is the LTP coincides with that funding round, so that is normally the last number that gets finalised into our budgets. But we just need to be mindful that this, while it's a valid revenue source, that we can't become overly reliant on it, or that it's got to be we've got to see the colour of the money to go, we think we're going to get $10 million in external funding for this project. How confident do we feel? And using the Deputy Mayor's words, what's the risk associated with it? And we'd probably likely to be more conservative to say we might get 2, but we'd hope to get 10. And that's where we need to, because it's been in the last 3 years, been such a significant part of our budgets, that it will have to feature within the financial strategy. And going forward, especially for the first half of the LTP, it will be important.
Sorry, again, Chair, the compensating for that by rates is not the only approach. I mean, you just cut your suit to suit your cloth. If you have less external funding, you do less.
Well, typically where we've balanced it off has been we'd borrow more. And so that's where, if it's a large project that we're getting third-party funding, we're probably borrowing on the other side. So it's that balance between debt and third-party funding. So we're not necessarily rating, because we wouldn't normally rate for that.
Rating for interest, though.
We're rating for interest. Yeah. But it's much better to say we might be higher in outer years and come in lower.
Rangi?
I mean, the Waka Kotahi example is, I mean, I can't believe that it still exists on its own funding mechanism. It only receives through fuel excise, road user charges, but there is no tax. None of our tax money, our income tax money, goes into Waka Kotahi, and it's a model I can't see how it can continue, because the demand for transport roading all over New Zealand far outweighs what it earns. Now, I'd hate to be doing the books for Waka Kotahi. It must be the most balanced budget known to mankind, because I can't see how it cannot increase its income. And with the advent of electric cars, there goes less fuel and no road user charges, but demand on the roads. So I just don't know when the government is going to wake up and smell the roses and say we need a different funding model for Waka Kotahi. It just defies logic.
Well,
So-
they are reviewing that now with electric cars, aren't they? That's under review.
Look,
Anyway,
yeah.
So
you need to be careful who you vote for next time.
Yep. the National Party position on that is they'll get rid of excise tax and road user tax, and then all vehicles, regardless of whether they're EVs or not, will have a classification and you just buy kilometres. I've asked Labor about that as well, and they're going down that track as well, I think, because they realise the model's broken with Waka Kotahi, but they just don't want to be seen to be agreeing with something with National at this stage. So the other comment I'd make was what you said, Patricia, about, we want $10 million from some grant and we conservatively think we might get 2 or 3 or 4. So we budget very conservatively. But the trouble is that when we get too conservative, as Tom quite rightly raises, we end up then having to subsidise more debt. So that's a risk for me. And certainly if it impacts on rates, it's definitely a worry area. We shouldn't be quite so conservative. Because if you think about a big project we got, which is the next big one, the museum, we've got lots of options there to raise funds. Some are dependent on others. Some come later in the cycle as opposed to early, but we should be able to get that across the line. And we shouldn't be conservative saying, hey, we need to put some more in. Because that's absolutely the last equation, part of the equation. So we'd have to fund it that way.
Through you, Ms. Joe, I think in response to what Ms. saying, I think you did right. Though when we put the museum in the last LTP, we had to be conservative. The numbers we put in for the museum and this LTP will be able to be much more realistic because we have more information.
Sure.
If you're putting a project out in year 6 or 7 and it's going to have some external funding, you can't be that certain. And that's what I'm meaning would be likely to be on the low side rather than on the high side.
So my view to that would be just do a few projects that you can actually deliver and not have too much a wish list out in the front that you subsequently build into a rate forecast.
Okay. And the last key issue from the financial strategy will be the funding and the provision for a natural disaster. This is a key audit issue, one of the few that we know about already. Legislatively, we have to fund 40% of rebuild costs. The government provides the balance. So we have to have...
That's 40% of infrastructure. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Do we self-insure all of our infrastructure?
We do actually insure our infrastructure.
Oh, we do insure.
We have some insurance. It is the local authority asset protection program. It's not
for
huge
our
amount.
for our pipe networks, but
Pipes.
we don't insure our roading networks, including bridges.
So
That's
roads,
predominantly because Waka Kotahi also co-fund, so we don't have any insurance on our roads.
So the point I was trying to get to is, so 40% of the rebuild costs means 40% of the uninsured rebuild costs, presumably.
yes. And that's another reason for having the debt headroom. So it tends to become, you've got to have that provision. The $20 million cash that we hold sits there, as your backup. The debt ceiling sits there as the backup. We have to just show that we have thought about it in the strategy so that we know that we can go, actually, this is how we're going to do it.
So what is it at the moment in percentage terms? What does the $20 million represent in terms of a percentage of...
It's just a number, isn't it?
I can't do that off the top of my head.
But is it at least 40%?
Yeah, we cover. That we can cover the 40%. Because that's assuming, of course, you have to make the assumption that you wouldn't lose 100% of your assets. That you would still, you're funding.
Can you not take an insurance out for that 40%?
You could. Might be prohibitively expensive though. because you're insuring against a natural disaster.
Could you not just use the money and borrow when the time comes?
Exactly, and that's a lot what self-insurance in this area sometimes is.
But you need to have the headroom in your balance sheet, though, right?
You need to have the headroom to do it.
To borrow.
Just quickly before we move on from that point, the other thing, whilst we keep talking about audit having these requirements, the other thing that it does give us a good benefit on is our rating agency. I mean, you have to remember that all these things feed into the rating assessment, and so one of the reasons why we have the rating that we do for our borrowing, which does have an impact on our costs, is because of all these things being in place as well.
Yeah. Evelyn, you were going to...
Yeah, I was just thinking that the provision for a natural disaster would include them looking at climate change provisions and things like that, where so not just something unexpected like AFA, but something that could be foreseen because we know what the modelling is telling us about. Yeah, so where we continue to allow people to live versus where perhaps might be a little bit problematic in 20 years time or 30 years time. Do we have to start having those conversations, and when, and is that one of the things we're going to be audited against?
Don't believe we'll be audited against that, but we certainly need to be considering that, and government policy in that area may not contribute to the cost of that coming forward, because I think this is currently under review by central government.
Yeah, well,
Excuse me, Chair, I have to leave.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're finished anyway.
That is, so the next step, so I've been taking notes as we've been going through. Then Russell and I are going to take this guidance away and use that as we put it into both the strategies as well as passing it on to the activity managers as they develop their asset and activity plans, which start coming to you next month. I think it's July you start seeing activity plan presentations.
Thank you. Righto, thank you. We're back online 3 o'clock, Darren. Okay, thanks for those live stream.
It's a good workshop.